Welcome. Thank you for joining our Laboratory Compliance Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Our featured speaker is Diane Gleinzer, USDM VP of Operations. The discussion today will cover introductions, USDM at a glance, webinar logistics, and our presentation topic, risk-based validation, a risk-based approach to computer systems validation in 21 CFR Part 11. Diane Gleinzer is the Vice President of Operations for USDM. She has 22 years experience in quality assurance and regulatory compliance within pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device industries. Her background is in GLP laboratories, QA and QC, auditing, project management, and overall regulatory compliance. Diane is our lab practice director. She leads the USDM operations team, and has done so well for over 10 years now. USDM is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing IT, quality, and regulatory compliance professional service solutions to the regulated industry. We're headquartered in Ventura, California, and we're a compliance partner for many best-of-breed vendors, including Oracle, SAP, Sparta Systems, which is TrackWise, and Agilent Technologies. We've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 130 life science clients, and we're the preferred compliance partner for small, mid-tier, and large life science companies. We specialize in assisting clients with reducing regulatory risk while maximizing their investment in quality management systems, as well as ECM, BI, laboratory instrument systems, and IT infrastructure. Our directive is to simplify, unify, and optimize compliance and business objectives. We will cover today the fundamentals of CSV, overview 21 CFR Part 11, and discuss an approach to CSV GAMP V Model 5, GAMP 5, risk-based CSV, and then we will wrap up with our closing statements and questions and answers. The content will be covered in about 30 minutes, and then you can interact with the team via the iLink message board. It's on the lower left of your session. We'll let you know the session is being recorded and will be posted to the USDM website. The overall goal of the webinar is to facilitate discussion, share ideas, and explore solutions together. Thank you for joining us, and now I'll turn the presentation over to Diane.
Thank you, Becky. I appreciate that. And welcome, everyone, to our webinar series. I know that the title doesn't look like this applies too much to lab sciences, and most of you may be saying, where is that? But all of this applies to lab sciences. There's just certain details that might differ in a laboratory situation. So what I want to start with is talking a bit about what computer systems validation is, a little bit about the regulations, and how they apply in laboratory situations. How can we apply a risk-based validation approach to legacy systems in the lab, to new systems in the lab, to LIMS systems? So let's get started with what is computer systems validation anyway? The FDA definition is on this slide, but at the end of the day, validation is confirmation that your computer system does what you want it to do, what you need it to do to meet your day-to-day business use. We all know computer systems are not free of defects. Every single useful computer system contains a bug or a defect, something that you didn't expect. They were not necessarily written to meet your intended use. You're manipulating them to meet your intended use. But there are defects within each one of them. Computer systems change because of bug fixes and new functionality enhancements. And each one of those changes that is introduced may very well introduce additional bugs into your system. Why is that relevant? Because we have to use computers in this day and world for conducting our day-to-day business. We use them to test drugs, products, raw material, We use them to control the equipment that manufactures our products. We use them in the conduct of clinical trials to control and manage our data. So we're using them every single day. We use computer systems to make sure that our work is more efficient and effective. And so the defects that we encounter are real to us every day, and they're in very close proximity to what we have to get done. So what can we do to minimize those factors? And validation is what does that. Validation makes sure that the system will perform its task, whether it's a lab system or a document management system, per its intended use, i.e., it does what it's supposed to do. We detect defects through validation prior to releasing the system into the general use of the population, of the lab. We make sure that the application, and when we talk about a system, there's a little bit of a breakdown here. We have application, which is the software that you're using, the equipment that's attached to that software or controlled by that software, so the HPLC or the LCMS or the flow cytometer, the hardware that system resides on, whether that's a standalone workstation, a laptop, or your internal network, and the documentation, the SOPs, the training documentation. What documentation do you need to run this system in a compliant manner? So we want to make sure, validation will make sure that the system is designed and implemented as needed to meet compliance and business needs. Validation also makes sure that necessary, thorough, and robust system testing is done efficiently. And when I say necessary, how do we determine what's necessary for a lab system? Again, it's got to be based on your intended use of that system. Once that HPLC system is validated, we need to make sure that the changes that are made to it are under control and that efficient testing and validation is accomplished. Efficient means doing what's enough. And so we'll go through some ways that you can determine how much testing is enough. By doing validation, we can make sure that our systems can be recovered, that the data we've generated and analyzed is reliable, and that we have consistent system operation throughout the life cycle of that system. There's a few other benefits to computer system validation. It's a way to make sure that our software quality has quality built in from the start. Adding quality by testing it in is not where you want to be here. We want to make sure that the software that you're going to use will work for you from day one. It also increases the usability and reliability of systems, which means that we have increased data reliability and data integrity. And in a lab situation, that's critical. We want to make sure that we decrease product manufacturing failure rates. So in a quality control lab, we can determine what's going to fail ahead of time. We can track and trend the data using additional software to ensure that we're not putting bad product out on the market. And not putting bad product out on the market means there's less risk to patients and reduced liability on your company's part. The CFRs that apply to life sciences vary from GLPs to GMPs to GCPs to Part 11 compliance. You go outside the U.S., we have Health Canada, we have EU, Annex 11, Annex 13. So they vary, but in general, they all define the expectations for practices for laboratory systems. And those practices include that you have to have procedures in place that describe how you process, what your business process is, whether you're labeling, producing equipment, manufacturing equipment, cleaning equipment, performing quality control tests, using laboratory equipment. You must have procedures in place to control and ensure consistency in how those procedures are performed. Your staff needs to be trained. They need adequate training in order to perform their intended jobs. And that includes consultants and contractors that you bring in. Process and equipment calibration, maintenance and cleaning or verification activities. The CFRs call out for that specifically. The operations, processes, and systems must be validated to show that they're fit for their intended use. Products, materials, equipment, facilities, supplies, we can go on and on and on, need to be traceable. And we need to show accountability. Who's responsible for making sure that these meet your needs and to meet the specifications that you've set for them? And last but not least, documentation and records. This is really primary for data integrity. I'm not going to go into a lot of the regulations here in this discussion because I think most of you are fairly well aware of them. But 21 CFR Part 11 is prior to the late 80s, prior to this act, people didn't use a lot of computer systems. They had paper-based systems. From the 80s forward, we've used and increased the use of computer systems in our laboratories every day. So now what Part 11 does is it extends the predicate rules, the good laboratory practices, good manufacturing practices, good clinical practices. It extends the regulations under the CFR to electronic systems. So if you maintain any electronic record that's required by the predicate rule, then you must validate the system that generates that record. So 21 CFR Part 11 applies to anybody who chooses to maintain records. If you choose to maintain paper-based records, and we'll talk a little bit about the typewriter rule in a minute and defining raw data, if you choose to maintain records in an electronic form that will be submitted to the FDA, then you have volunteered to comply with Part 11. The typewriter rule in 2003 kind of came out because there was a lot of systems that generate paper records, but they're not being used as the system of record. The electronic files are not being used. The FDA at that time, early 2000s, said that if you are using a system primarily to generate the paper record, you print that paper record and you use that paper record as the record, the master record, then you did not need to maintain the electronic form of that record because the system was being used as a typewriter. Annex 11 last year, which is EU Part 11 compliance, European Union, was updated, and it went into effect July 1st of 2011, and it disallows the use of paper records as the sole master record. It says that if you use an electronic record to generate a paper record, then both records must be maintained, and the system that generates that paper record must be validated. So that's been a source of contention in laboratories for a while because people print out chromatograms, they print out the data, and then they call that their raw data, and so they don't need to validate the record. Annex 11 only applies to European Union right now and to pharma. However, there's been a great deal of discussion over the last few months around the Internet, around the FDA, about the potential for extending the Annex 11 regulations to more of a harmonized approach worldwide. It could be applied to medical device companies. It could be applied across the board to laboratories. And FDA is looking at them. Obviously, they're still making up their mind as to whether or not they're going to issue a new opinion on Part 11, but I believe that this will be incorporated into their new opinion. In addition, impact of Part 11 on computer systems validation. In July 2010, the FDA announced that they will be conducting a series of inspections in an effort to evaluate how industry is complying and understanding Part 11. And so they have piggybacked a large number of newly hired computer science degreed inspectors. They're piggybacking them onto the regular inspections. So they're trying to see how laboratories, manufacturing facilities, medical device companies are actually interpreting and applying Part 11. And in addition to that, they're writing 483s for findings now, which they had not done previously. So over the last year or two, we've seen a vast number across the board, from laboratories through packaging facilities, everywhere, where the number of Part 11 deficiencies has increased. Mainly, I would say that's trending towards documentation of practices, how you do things, training records, and actually complying with the procedures that you write. FDA enforces provisions related to the following controls and requirements in the laboratory. Limiting system access to authorized individuals. That can sometimes be a huge issue. A lot of laboratories that I see still use group logins for certain teams. And it's because people need to use a computer system. They may have one computer system that is controlling multiple instruments. And so they're using one login because when the screen logs out, you need the person who originally logged in to start that equipment. And that doesn't comply with Part 11. So there have to be procedural controls and some updates to how we, in a laboratory, enforce these logins. Use of operational system authority checks and device checks. If your system has to enforce a series of events, then you have to show in your validation that you do enforce that series of events. Determination that persons who develop, maintain, and use electronic systems have the education, training, and experience to perform their assigned tasks. Again, it goes back to training. We're seeing a number of 483s written, and there are pieces of warning letters out there that are specifically focused around insufficient documentation of training for people to perform their tasks. And in a laboratory environment, you may have a few scientists using a large number of equipment. It needs to be shown that they have the experience to do that, whether they're trained on the job and they document that, or they have the background through their degree, their experience. Needs to be shown what training people need to have and that they do have it. Establishment of and adherence to written policies that hold individuals accountable for actions under their electronic signatures. In a laboratory, people are using more and more electronic signatures. Not all lab systems have great electronic signature capabilities, but it's certainly an added efficiency if you can approve documentation online. And so in order to do that, you need to have a policy on electronic signatures, and you need to have the people who will be applying that policy and actually creating the electronic signature, doing the approvals, sign an affidavit that they're aware that that electronic signature is the legal equivalent of their handwritten signature. And that's so that they can't come back down the line and say, I didn't know what that meant. That's not my signature. It didn't mean what I thought it did. The reason for signature is right there, and they have to be aware that this is a legal equivalent of their handwritten signature. And then obviously the FDA enforces requirements related to electronic signatures and audit trails. And many laboratories have systems that do not have audit trail capability nor electronic signature capability, but the audit trail is critical. So we need to have procedures in place and be looking at whether or not we can replace this legacy equipment now with something that has a more current Part 11 compliant capability. In order to successfully complete a lab project for computer systems validation, we need to plan and execute the efforts and make sure that they're efficient and focused. We need to make sure that the system does what it's supposed to do. It needs to be installed correctly. It needs to be configured so that you can use it the way you intended to, and that configuration needs to be documented because that forms the basis for change control. We need to make sure we've implemented the correct functionality to meet our user requirements. And we need to make sure that we have complete implementation of business processes on the system. And in order to do that, we need to be able to define our business processes. Once the system is validated, we need to make sure that changes are done in a controlled manner. Again, that's the basis for change management is the validated state of the system. Everything's documented at that point. Any changes that you make need to be documented in some manner. We need to make sure that we're testing in an efficient but thorough way. Where we have critical business requirements, we need to be able to find out what those requirements are, weed those out of the pack of requirements, and focus our testing on those. We need to make sure for data integrity that we can recover data if we have a crash, if we have a flood, if we have an earthquake. We need to be able to get that data back to maintain business continuity. We want to make sure that system and supporting standard operating procedures are in place. We want to make sure our users are trained, and we want to make sure that the documentation is authored and released opportunely in a flowing manner, in the correct manner, that we're limiting the approvers to those people who have the knowledge to approve them, and that we're doing this efficiently. This is just a diagram of a typical CSV model. We've got all sorts of documentation that you can use in computer systems validation. What should apply to a piece of lab equipment as opposed to an enterprise resource planning system? There are ways that we can put together to justify how we determine those levels. GAMP 5 is really a standard process. It is not the only process for computer system validation, but it is a known process. It's a common sense process. And one reason that I recommend GAMP 5 is that not only do we all like it, it's fairly simple to follow. There's a lot of people following it out there, so there's precedent, there's knowledge. The FDA knows it. So when something happens and you have an audit, if you follow a standard methodology, the FDA understands that methodology and they know what they're looking for. If they have to figure out your methodology, you've just invited them to sit with you for a bit longer. For laboratory systems, we have some added documentation. We have vendor-provided IQ and OQ on equipment. We potentially have vendor-provided IQ and OQ on the software that controls that equipment. Where do those fit in here? How about preventive maintenance documentation, calibration documentation, vendor audits? We want to make the most use out of that documentation that the vendor's providing us. Within GAMP 5, what they discuss is gaining some sense of reliance on your vendor. Most vendors, all vendors come in and leave you documentation when they install your HPLC or when they install your flow cytometer and they put it in place. They'll leave you some documentation. Make use of that documentation. In order to make use of that documentation, we want to make sure that we have some faith in the vendor's abilities to install and write this documentation, and we do that through vendor audits. So if you audit your vendor, if you ask them the right questions, if you ensure that they built their product, and if applicable, their software in a quality manner, then you can rely on the vendor-provided IQ and OQ to meet your own requirements internally. You can rely on the preventive maintenance documentation that you're going to implement under change control so that you have the information you need. That means you have to do less work every year to show the system continues to meet its intended use. Calibration documentation applies for that also. So the vendor packages that are left to you in the laboratory are very valuable. You still have a complete validation package, but a lot of the requirements that you create can be met by the vendor documentation, and that allows you to focus your efforts for laboratory system qualification to the way that it's going to meet your use, to testing your own user requirements, rather than testing out-of-the-box functionality, rather than testing the calculations. You can really limit the amount of testing that you do and make it far more efficient. And some other SOPs that typically would support a CS initiative in the lab: use and operations of laboratory equipment. Backup and restoring of data, that goes directly to data integrity. If you can't get it back, then there was no point in generating it. Access and security for lab systems. Again, we talked a little bit about the fact that we typically use a lot of group logins. How can we control that? Can we continue to use that in a regulated environment? How do we control that? What procedures do we have to put into place to be able to meet the Part 11 requirements and yet allow for flexibility within our laboratory environments to be able to use the systems that we need to use. Contingency and disaster recovery procedures. What happens if there is a disaster? What happens if there's a flood or an earthquake? How do we recover for that? How do we rebuild our systems? Decommissioning lab systems. As we start moving out our legacy systems, we want to go ahead and do something with that data. The data that was generated needs to be able to be recoverable for as long as the regulations say or as long as you need it. And so how do we go back and take a system out of use and still be able to access that data? So we need to put plans in place to do that, whether we PDF that data, whether we print it into hard copy, whether we migrate it into a new system through an upgrade. Obviously, training SOPs, audit SOPs, there has to be periodic review of your validation data, just as there has to be periodic review of your internal SOPs. What's a good time period for that? When we say periodic review, you have to establish for your own lab what that periodicity is. Calibration and maintenance of lab systems, critical to have a program in place or software in place that helps you to control that. Again, that goes directly towards data integrity. Configuration management, how do we manage the changes to our system configuration that may occur over time? And overall change control, what do we do when we want to upgrade a software package or change out an HPLC pump? How much to validate is the eternal question. The level of validation effort depends on how complex your system is and what impact that system might have on patient safety, product quality, data integrity. You have to really look at regulatory compliance and legal risk also if you're generating data to meet proprietary needs. You can assess the system level risk based on GAMP-5 software categories. GAMP-5 offers a list of categories that expand, that go from 1 to 5, and it tells you for the simplest of systems like operating software, pipe headers, it has some examples in there. Then all you need to do is document that they're installed properly and that you meet calibration requirements. GAMP-2 would be a little bit more. It would be maybe something like a PLC controller on the manufacturing floor that does have software, but it's really not configurable at all. GAMP-3-4, it would be configurable products, so off-the-shelf products, but they're fairly highly, they span the range of configurability from minimally configurable to hugely configurable. And then GAMP-5 category, or Category 5, would be products that are custom. So you're actually writing the code. So we can assess the system risk level, and that gives us some information, but what else can we do? We can also assess each system at the functional level. So once we determine our user requirements, once we figure out what functionality of the system we need to meet our user requirements, we can take a look at each of those functions we've identified and determine the risk if that function were to fail. For standard out-of-the-box software functionality, that risk is probably pretty minimal. For a functionality that you have to configure specifically, that may have a higher risk. If you look at this, GAMP-5 proposes a lifestyle risk approach. So they say you've got to manage risk from the very time you start planning for what system you're going to bring in or bring on. You manage that right through your planning process. You manage that through the project that you have to implement that system. Once that system is in operation, you periodically assess the risk. You're always going to go back to the risks you identified. When you identify risks, you're going to identify mitigation strategies and ways to control risk. And you're going to see if your strategies are working. And then you'll reassess if they're not working. And then again, at retirement, there's risk assessment, even just prior to retiring your system. There's retention issues. How do you get the data back? Are we going to destroy the data? Are we going to destroy the system? Do we have to maintain the system? And what's the risk if we don't? A high-level risk management approach is starting off from day one when you first start planning for the system, You perform an initial risk assessment, determine the system impact. Then the system, again, we said it's application level, it's hardware level, it's instrument level, it's the people. So what's the impact on your staff? And what's the impact on training and documentation? Do you need to add more for this? Identify the functionality of the system that have the highest impact on data integrity, patient safety, product quality. Perform the functional risk assessment at that functional requirement level and identify controls that you can put into place. You're going to implement and verify that the controls were appropriate. And then you're going to review the risk and you're going to monitor the controls as you go through the life cycle of the system. So you never stop assessing risk until that system is fully retired. I'm going to skip through some of these, but the process steps themselves are pretty simple. Identify the risk item, assess the impact, assess the severity, assess the probability the risk could even occur, assess how easy it would be to detect the risk if it does occur, and that gives you a risk priority, high, medium, or low. Initiate the controls, which can include validation testing. Verify how effective your controls are. Document and monitor the risk. So keep looking, keep watching. You want to track and trend the highest risk items. Is there any residual risk? So after you implement the mitigation, something that really couldn't be controlled, can pieces of it be controlled? And again, periodically review and reevaluate. When this webinar is posted, you can certainly read through the risk steps in detail. There's some more detail for how you assess risk. But what I wanted to wrap this up with was talking about the GAMP-5 methodology and just doing sort of a quick example of how you would assess a risk. So let's say that we have a lab system that's used for quality control, and you have a requirement that you need to be able to control an HPLC through this system. You need to be able to start the system, the HPLC system, through the software. So our risk, we need to go through first, and we need to say, what is the real risk? The real risk is that the system that you put a run on that HPLC, you start the system through the software, and the system never starts. All right, if the system doesn't start, well, what's the business impact if it doesn't start? Well, that could vary based on certain scenarios, so you might want to break it out into certain scenarios, but it would be probably a pretty big business impact regardless. So if we had a high business impact, and that would be the severity level, now we want to look at the probability of occurrence. If this is a commercial, out-of-the-box function of the system, then it probably works because it was designed to work, and you probably would know just from your vendor audit, your assurance that the vendor has done his job, that the system is going to start. You know it's going to start. So it probably has a low probability that the risk would actually occur. So if you look on this chart that's on the screen, the severity was high, the probability of risk was low. You have a medium risk at this point, and that is the risk class. Now we have how likely is it you're going to see the risk if it occurs. And I use the rule of thumb. Is somebody going to yell? So we have a risk class of medium, which was a 2. We have a detectability of high because if that run doesn't start, somebody's going to know. And so it's easy to detect. It was a medium risk. And if you draw the line to connect those two, we now have a low risk. Do we need to test low risk? So you have this risk assessment. Now it's up to you to determine how much risk you want to assume and how much risk you're willing to bring into the company or the process if you don't test that. But in general, you can recommend that at least you'll do very minimal testing on anything that's low risk. If something is moderately risky or medium risk, you would do more testing. And if something was high risk, then you would certainly want to do boundary testing, worst-case scenario testing. So that's a good way to try to manage the amount of testing that you have to do and actually to focus your testing on the highest risk functionality of the system. And that wraps up the presentation. I think we've run a little bit over, but I do tend to be long-winded. I think, Becky will let me know if you have questions. Right, Becky?
Absolutely. Thank you, Diane. Yes, we do appreciate that some of you have questions for us. And while you're typing them in, I will ask you to look at the bottom left hand of your screen, and that's where you'll see the chat. You can just send the questions in there, and we'll get answers for you. I realize some of them may be of a confidential nature, so we're happy to address them after the fact with you directly. Just to remind you, the session has been recorded and will be available on our website, which of course is usdatamanagement.com. I'd encourage you to visit the site, and you can see additional upcoming webinars, events that we're posting, and we have quite a few recorded sessions of our previously presented topics. The information shared there, I believe, will be useful for your team as well. We would invite you to join our discussion. There's a forum on LinkedIn. We welcome your insight there, your feedback, and your suggestions for future topics. Help us to know how we can best help you with any pain points or offering direction in compliance. If you like our webinar, we'd encourage you to let us know that by clicking the like button on the USDM LinkedIn group page, or even better, post a comment for us. It might take you about 60 seconds and would mean the world to us. In 2012, it's going to be a very important indicator that our management team is looking at and using as a basis to determine whether to continue funding our complimentary series. So just let us know that it's useful, it's a good use of your time, and that we're on target. Let's see. Oh, here's our first question. It's from James. Okay. He's asking, Diane, when you refer to the Yale test, do you distinguish between the FDA, the QA, and the business groups?
I think it's if anybody yells. I think if you're talking about is somebody going to notice? You have to look at your business process, because if the person who's actually operating the equipment is the one who's yelling, that's your best risk scenario. If it gets all the way to QA and QA says, hey, this didn't work, well, even then, that might change the risk level to medium or the detectability to medium instead of low. So maybe you'd want to adjust your risk level a bit. But again, you've still detected something before it went out into the field. So there's different levels of risk. If it's simple to detect, if it's a little more difficult to detect and it might take longer to detect, you might want to increase that risk level.
Terrific. And James, I believe she captured your part 2 of your question there about who is doing the yelling. Part 3 from James, and thank you for your questions, James. What do you think QA's role is in the testing?
QA's role in testing is overseeing and ensuring that you've followed procedures, that you have applied the correct procedures, and to verify through review of the evidence, the review of whatever documentation you provided, that you maintained data integrity, that you really haven't changed data in the first place, that you have reported all of the data, that you haven't eliminated data unnecessarily. And again, it's that high level, are we good here? It's did we follow our procedures? Can we report this data? And is it repeatable? Is it good data?
Very good. Thank you, Diane. Oh, hello, Kai. Thank you for your question. Let's see. Kai is asking, can we develop CSV protocols for all types equipment, i.e. specialized equipment such as MS and CDs, which are typically used for product characterization?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. The question is, can we develop CSV protocols for all types of equipment, i.e. specialized equipment such as MS and CDs, which are typically used for product characterization?
Thank you. Sorry, I missed the first part of it, so that's great. Thanks. Yes, absolutely. And what we typically recommend, the process doesn't change no matter what the system is. So you start off with a set of templates that has some content in there, and then you just modify those templates for your specialized equipment. But the process stays the same for every piece of equipment and really even for other applications. So when we come into a company and we bring our set of templates, there's already so much text in there that is just very applicable, and then you just change the details that you need. So obviously your user requirements are different, your functional specs are different, but the base document doesn't really change. The master plan, how you're going to approach it, doesn't really change. So yes, you can create. Start with a set of templates and then create specific protocols for each set of equipment from those templates.
Thank you, Diane. And part 2, if they implement the extension, when do you think the implementation of the extension?
Implement an extension, I don't understand the question.
If they implement the extension, when do you think it should happen, I believe? Is that the question, Kai? You want to clarify that for me a little bit? Annex 11. EU.
Annex 11. Got it. Okay.
Thank you.
So Annex 11 applies now. It's in place. If they, it's already there. It applies today. I believe that the FDA is really implementing basic provisions. For instance, we talked about the raw data. Used to be that you could define raw data as your system of record. And if you look on the FDA website, there are guidances and guidelines that say there's a specific instance that references a chromatogram being a system of record. And they say that because the system that generated it actually does not print out all of the metadata, that you must maintain chromatography raw data files so that you can have access to all of the metadata, because not all the metadata will print out. So I think, as far as a formal extension, I don't know. They were supposed to come out with a formal opinion a couple of years ago, then again a year ago. We really haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean that their interpretation isn't changing. And some of those hints that they're changing are on their website. So will they actually make a formal presentation? I think that they will, and there'll be a formal extension. But right now, I would strongly recommend that you comply with Part 11 in the spirit. And I think that they've made it quite clear that some of these other provisions are applicable.
Thank you, Diane. Let's see, here's a question from Jack. What's an appropriate strategy translating the findings of a vendor audit to a level of assurance in the quality of that vendor's documentation?
So that's a really good question. What we typically do, because a lot of times you're not going to change the equipment that you buy. The vendor audit, if you use a vendor audit well, it can point you in the direction of the proper vendor. But typically we end up doing vendor audits after we've made our decision, because it would be expensive to go out and do one for every vendor you were looking at. So how do we use that information that we get from that vendor audit? Well, first of all, you can follow up and see that they make their changes, and you see how well they make their changes and how effectively and efficiently they do that. Secondly, you can take your findings and put them into your risk assessment. So you're probably always going to have findings from a vendor audit. Assess the risk of each one of those findings and see, do I need to focus some more testing around the areas where we have the highest risk? So that's a really good way to use the findings and assure yourself that vendor is performing in a quality manner, and cover yourself for those parts where they may not be performing as well.
Very good. Very good. Okay, additional questions from James. How close does the FDA recommend or allow the development groups get to the testing process? And is there a rough idea when Annex 11 will be applicable to the U.S.? Does this apply if you're manufacturing in the U.S. but selling in EU?
It does apply if you're manufacturing in the U.S. If you have any business dealings in the EU, it does apply if you sell any product there. When it will, I think I've answered when it will apply. I don't think anybody has a timeline for that yet. And what was the first part of the question, Vicki?
How closely does the FDA recommend or allow development groups to get the testing process?
So the FDA tells you where you have to get to, but they do not tell you how to get there. So it's really up to you. If you are generating, developing product, developing code, then you should follow a standard system development lifecycle process, whether it's agile methodology, whatever waterfall methodology. You should have a methodology, and you should be coding to standards. Those are best practices. The FDA were to come in and you were developing your own code, then I think that if they were to trace something back, they'd certainly want to see that you're in control. And that ultimately is the goal, right, for all these regulations. They want documented evidence that you are in control of your process. So the more you develop according to standards, the more that you build according to standards, the more that you test according to approved methodology, then the better off you're going to be. And not only to comply with the regulations, but also in having a far more robust product at the end of the day.
Very good. Those of you posting compliments and thank yous, we do appreciate that. Mary, I see your question. I understand it's confidential, and I will follow up with you later today. Looks like Kai has one additional comment. His questions again around implementing extensions was specific to the typewriter rule. Are we clear there for you, Kai? Is there anything else that you'd like us to address, or did we capture that in our questions and answers already? Yep, he says we're good. Okay, very good. I think that we should go ahead and wrap up here. It's 10 minutes to the hour, and thank you for staying on with us. So many of you are participating here. We certainly do appreciate that. If the session has been helpful, we'd ask again that you go to our LinkedIn group page. You'll see the discussion posted there. Just click on the like button and let us know that it has been a good use of your time. Diane, thank you so much for presenting. Excellent information there. And again, thank you all for taking the time to join us. We appreciate this opportunity to team with you in working towards excellence and compliance. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.